Welcome to our second lecture of week 6 as we wrap up progressivism today in the progressive era with an in-depth look at the presidential election of 1912 and also an examination of progressivism under Woodrow Wilson. The election of 1912. Our last lecture on Monday, I discussed William Howard Taft and the reforms and the progressive initiatives, the progressive policies that Taft supported and pushed through Congress, most notably the passage of the 16th Amendment in 1909, which was ratified in 1912 and enacted in 1913. The 16th Amendment established the graduated federal income tax in which American workers would have to pay annual income tax to the federal government, and the rate of that tax fluctuated based on an individual's personal income for that year. So high earners paid a higher rate of tax, and workers in the middle and at the bottom of the income spectrum paid lower percentages of their income in federal taxes. But that was supported by William Howard Taft and eventually enacted in 1913. Also, the 17th Amendment, which was supported by Taft, that called for the direct election of U.S. senators, taking the power away from individual state legislatures, which had previously selected the 2 U.S. senators for each of the states prior to the Taft administration. That passed in 1912 and was enacted shortly after Taft left office in 1913, and ever since then, American voters, the American electorate, the voting public, has been able to choose their senators directly at the ballot box. But all of that started during the Taft administration, and I mentioned toward the end of Monday's lecture that those were actually initiatives that were part of the People's Party platform, the Populist Party platform back in 1892 at the Omaha Convention. The Populists were unsuccessful in getting those passed because they just didn't win enough seats in Congress, and they did not ever have a presidential candidate that won an election. But William Howard Taft, a Republican president, passed those 2 amendments during the progressive era. So, as the election of 1912 approached, there was a significant event that occurred a couple years before the election in 1910 when William Howard Taft's Secretary of the Interior, Richard Ballinger, provided federal land in Alaska to an investor group who then turned around and sold a portion of the property to a mining company. Well, that drew concern from progressives, and in particular from Gifford Pinchot, who we discussed in Monday's lecture. Pinchot was a friend of Roosevelt's, and Roosevelt had supported his appointment as the head of the U.S. Forestry Division in 1898, back when Roosevelt was the vice president to William McKinley. And Pinchot and Roosevelt subscribed to that conservationist philosophy, which was to regulate federal public land so that it was available for both private individual usage by the public as well as for commercial development by businesses and corporations, and that they didn't want neither Pinchot nor Roosevelt wanted the land to be completely controlled by corporate interests because they feared that they would strip all of the natural resources or the bulk of the natural resources from these public lands and leave nothing left for future generations of Americans to enjoy through outdoor activities and for future business development as well. So Gifford Pinchot reacts to Ballinger's deal with anger, and he wound up exposing that business deal publicly because it didn't align with the principles of conservation that he and Teddy Roosevelt had worked so hard to promote. In response, Taft fired Pinchot from his U.S. Forestry Division leadership post, and Ballinger was investigated by a congressional committee. However, he was ultimately cleared of any corruption, but he wound up resigning after the investigation and its findings were released. Roosevelt did not appreciate Taft's firing of Pinchot. He criticized Taft for being too conservative and too aligned with business interests and moving away from progressivism. Another strong critic of Taft during this time was Robert La Follette, who was a senator from Wisconsin and was sort of widely regarded to be the most progressive national politician of the era. But Roosevelt used the Ballinger-Pinchot saga as an avenue to criticize Taft, and he criticized some of Taft's other policies. And it basically constituted a feud between Roosevelt and Taft, and as a result, Roosevelt decided to enter into the fray and challenge Taft for the Republican nomination for the 1912 presidential campaign. Something of a unprecedented step for a former president to come back and challenge his successor, particularly when the successor in this case with Taft was someone that had been endorsed and pretty much handpicked by Roosevelt on his way out the door. Just a few short years later, Roosevelt would attack Taft rhetorically in the campaign as being too conservative, which actually wasn't completely true. Many of Taft's policies were more progressive than the actions that Roosevelt had accomplished during his 8 years as president. For example, Taft brought more than twice as many antitrust suits than Roosevelt did as far as corporate oversight. He also created the Children's Bureau, which was a organization designed to regulate child labor, and as I mentioned earlier, supported the 16th and 17th Amendments and navigated them through Congress and passage and ratification. However, Roosevelt was simply a very popular presidential candidate within the Republican Party, and even though Taft was the sitting Republican president, the incumbent, Roosevelt won most of the Republican primary races during the spring and summer of 1912. Yet, despite this popular support, the party leadership remained firmly behind William Howard Taft. They backed Taft at the convention, and he wound up receiving the Republican nomination. This angered the delegates who had showed up at the convention to vote for Roosevelt, the delegates that he had won during the primary process, and they decided that they would hold their own convention and nominate the former president. He accepted the nomination and ran as the progressive candidate, known as the bull moose candidate. It was a term that Roosevelt used to describe himself in political speeches during the campaign. And so it unofficially became the name of this third-party ticket, the bull moose candidate of Theodore Roosevelt, against the Republican incumbent William Howard Taft. Meanwhile, while Roosevelt and Taft battled for the support of Republican voters, there was another third-party candidate in the race, Eugene Debs, the socialist leader who ran as a socialist candidate. And of course, the Democrats nominated a candidate for president. It was Woodrow Wilson. Wilson was a Southerner. He was born in Virginia and had been raised in Georgia and South Carolina. And he went on to have a sterling career as an academic prior to entering politics. He was a history professor at Princeton University in New Jersey and later became Princeton University's president. And he was serving as Princeton's president when he decided to run for and wound up winning the New Jersey gubernatorial election in 1910. So the Democrats wound up nominating New Jersey Governor Woodrow Wilson as their presidential candidate for 1912. All four of these candidates, it's important to note, believed in progressivism to a certain extent, to a certain degree. They all had a basic philosophy that the federal government needed to be more of an activist federal government, if you will, a federal government that would be more willing to intervene on behalf of the American people with regards to the business and living conditions of modern America. Things that were increasingly challenging for Americans to deal with and adjust to, such as the rise of corporations and business growth, population growth in cities, and other conditions, housing conditions that we spoke about in previous lectures, the new automobile, which was in its infancy at this time, but had been around for a good decade or so by the time the 1912 presidential campaign rolled around. So all four of these candidates believed in an interventionist or activist federal government to a certain degree. And that's a stark departure from the late 19th century when you had a series of Republicans from Rutherford B. Hayes, or a series of presidents, I should say, from Rutherford B. Hayes through Grover Cleveland, who all believed in some form or another that the government's job was to sort of stay out of business affairs and let business handle itself, and the federal government was supposed to take a more of a passive role, allow the states to come up with most of their own laws. We saw that with the Jim Crow segregation laws that were passed in the South during this time. That was basically the 19th century model for presidential candidates and their views on the role of the federal government in American life. That was not the model. It was the opposite for the four candidates in the 1912 election: William Howard Taft, Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and Eugene Debs. While all of these candidates believed in this sort of activist federal government, the two that emerged as the main contenders for the presidency were Wilson, the Democratic nominee, and the former president, Theodore Roosevelt, on the bull moose ticket. Roosevelt advocated new nationalism, which was a philosophy that more or less consisted of using government to create programs in the interest of the public good. For example, he believed that the federal government should create a workers' compensation program for laborers who suffered major injuries on the job. He wanted a more stringent Bureau of Corporations and other policies that would improve working conditions for women and children, and provide more federal regulation in that aspect of the labor industry. Meanwhile, Wilson promoted New Freedom, a philosophy which emphasized the elimination of corporate trusts, reducing the power of Wall Street on the overall financial industry and affairs of the nation, and lowering tariffs. He also believed in transferring a significant amount of the social programs that were under the direction of the federal government to the states, and to allow state governments to oversee those programs. So that was New Freedom. That was the ideas of Woodrow Wilson in the election of 1912. So you have a bit of a contrast between Roosevelt and Wilson, as Roosevelt wanted more programs in the public good, more social welfare type programs than Wilson was willing to accept. So what was the outcome of the election of 1912? Well, in a divided race, Woodrow Wilson emerged victorious. A majority of voters chose Wilson. He won, frankly, in a landslide. You can see in the upper right-hand corner of this slide, that is the electoral map of 1912, and all of those states that are blue in that illustration went for Wilson. The states that are green went for Teddy Roosevelt, and you see just two states that were red, Utah and Vermont, won by William Howard Taft. So the final tally, Woodrow Wilson received 6.3 million votes and won an astounding 435 electoral votes. Teddy Roosevelt received 4.1 million votes overall and claimed 88 electoral votes. That's interesting to note because that was at the time, and it still to this day remains the strongest showing ever by a third-party candidate in a presidential election. These days we have third-party candidates every 4 years in elections. Most of the time they struggle to get more than 1 or 2% of the vote, because usually there's a Green Party candidate representing sort of an ultra-liberal philosophy, and there's usually a Libertarian candidate which is believes in the some of the economic principles of conservatism, while but not the social principles of conservatism. And there are several other minor parties as well. So we've become accustomed in America to seeing third-party candidates on the presidential ballot, but rarely do any of these candidates make a major wave in terms of winning states or tilting the balance in the final outcome. One notable exception to that was in the election of 1992, which we will discuss later in this semester, when Ross Perot ran as a third-party candidate and siphoned off quite a few votes from the Republican incumbent George H.W. Bush, enabling Bill Clinton to win the presidency with less than 50% of the popular vote. But most of the time, third-party candidates make a very minimal impact in terms of the amount of votes that they receive. Teddy Roosevelt, due in large part to his popularity based on his 8 years as president from 1901 to 1909, is the exception to that rule, as he won 4.1 million votes and claimed 88 electoral votes. It remains the strongest showing ever for a third-party candidate. As for William Howard Taft, as I mentioned it earlier with the look at the election map, he received 3.5 million votes in this election, but just 8 electoral votes, as he won just 2 states, Utah and Vermont, each state with 4 electoral votes apiece. So Wilson was the big winner in the election of 1912, and the Democrats reclaimed the presidency for the first time since Grover Cleveland won the 1892 election and served until 1897. In addition to Wilson's victory at the top of the ticket, the Democrats also won a majority of seats in the House and the Senate. This gave the Democratic Party control of the White House as well as both houses of Congress for the first time since the mid-1890s. So a rather momentous election in 1912, and one that was certainly, I'm sure, very intriguing as it unfolded nationwide, with 4 candidates, 3 of them winning multiple states and millions of votes at the polls, and of course the big rift between the 2 Republicans that had served as president, Taft, the incumbent, and Roosevelt, his predecessor, that made for some very interesting coverage and some very interesting debates along the campaign trail. So a very significant election, the election of 1912, in which Woodrow Wilson ascends to the presidency with his victory. So let's take a look at what happens under the Wilson administration. What does progressivism look like with Woodrow Wilson as president? Well, Wilson, like his 2 immediate predecessors, Taft and Roosevelt, did push for several significant progressive policies. First and foremost, he believed that the nation's banking system needed to be restructured, reorganized, that it was too reliant on the New York City banks. The New York City banks had an outsized influence on the entire banking industry. Wilson thought that this was simply not prudent and would result in inefficiency and a weak financial industry going forward. So, at Wilson's urging, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. This act, this legislation, I should say, created a new banking system in which 12 Federal Reserve banks were established across the nation. These were regional Federal Reserve banks in different regions of the country. All national banks became members of the Federal Reserve System, and state banks were not required to become members of the Federal Reserve banking system, but they had the option of joining if they wanted. So the member banks of the Federal Reserve System were required to place 6% of their capital and a portion of their reserves into a Federal Reserve Bank, and the Federal Reserve banks as a whole had the ability to expand bank credit and money supply as necessary. They also were able to supervise the national banks and the state banks that joined, and could adjust interest rates as they saw fit as well. And if you follow the financial industry or the politics of finance and the Treasury, today, you know that the Federal Reserve System is still in place. We still have a Federal Reserve System. We have a Fed chairman who is the person overseeing of the Federal Reserve System, but there are regional commissioners that serve on the Federal Reserve Board in addition to the chairman, and there are Federal Reserve banks and offices in regions across the country. For example, there's a Federal Reserve office and Federal Reserve Bank in Atlanta, Georgia, in the southeast. So this system is still in place, but it didn't exist until Woodrow Wilson became president. He was the one that really championed this and argued that it was necessary, and he was able to get his Democratic Congress, or Democratic majority Congress, I should say, to pass it and make it a federal legislation creating the Federal Reserve Act. Wilson also took on the trusts. Mainly, he thought that some of the federal government's regulatory policies and procedures needed to be upgraded. The Bureau of Corporations existed at this time, but Wilson thought that it needed to be stronger and have more regulatory power, so he established the Federal Trade Commission, or FTC, in 1914 in an attempt to provide more stringent regulation of corporations. The the Federal Trade Commission is still part of the federal government to this day. It's a significant part of the Department of Commerce and Treasury today, as the FTC plays a regulatory role. And again, this was something that existed in the form of the Bureau of Corporations before Wilson came in, but he basically streamlined it and made it, gave it greater powers to regulate corporations. Also, the Clayton Antitrust Act was passed by Congress during this time. Wilson supported the Clayton Antitrust Act. This effectively replaced the Sherman Antitrust Act, which had been passed in the 1890s, and it provided some protection for individuals by, again, placing federal checks on corporations. In particular, it eliminated price discrimination, the process of a business selling a product to one customer at one price and selling it to another customer at a different price, either a higher or a lower price, based on the discretion of the business. That practice was referred to as price discrimination. That was eliminated by the Clayton Antitrust Act. It also regulated corporate mergers and provided enhanced protection for the act of collective bargaining by labor unions. So the labor unions that we discussed last week in the 1880s and 1890s that participated in so many of those strikes that the presidents, I should say, from that era frequently broke up the strikes or sent in federal troops to break up the strikes, such as Grover Cleveland with the Pullman strike in the 1890s. All of a sudden, there was enhanced federal protection for the act of collective bargaining and the tactics that labor unions could use to acquire collective bargaining, such as strikes and boycotts and things of that nature. So that was a big component of the Clayton Antitrust Act. Shifting gears from business and federal regulation to social justice and race, in these areas, Woodrow Wilson was not very progressive at all. He promoted financial regulations and banking reforms. However, Wilson declined to push for enhanced social welfare programs. He did not support a federal suffrage amendment, so he didn't support the federal legislation that would have provided women with the right to vote. He also did not push for any sort of federal legislation regarding child labor. And Wilson also declined to support legislation that would provide federal loans to farmers in emergency situations. Wilson argued that farmers, that if he did that for farmers, and it would establish a precedent, and other organizations and other industries would want the same sort of protection when their members fell on hard times. So he felt like he just couldn't prioritize farmers or any single profession or industry over the rest of American business, and that's what he thought that legislation would do. Nonetheless, that didn't help farmers, and as we progress in this semester, we'll discuss some of the New Deal legislation that Franklin Delano Roosevelt pushed through in the 1930s, and part of that, one of the major elements, was subsidies to American farmers. And the subsidy programs exist in one way or another even today. Farmers get federal subsidies depending on the industry and things like that, depending on what type of crops you're producing and things like that. But Wilson had a chance to support this back in his presidency in the 1910s, and he did not support that. I mentioned earlier in our discussion today that Wilson was a native Southerner. Not surprising, considering he was a white male that grew up in the South in the late 19th century. He did not have tolerant views of African Americans. He, simply put, did not support racial equality for African Americans. When he was a college student at Princeton University, Wilson opposed extending voting rights, or the franchise, if you will, to black men. He also argued during that time that Americans like himself with Anglo-Saxon ancestry would never accept African Americans, which he explicitly described as, quote, an ignorant and inferior race, unquote, as social and political equals. So he would never accept black men or African Americans in general as the social equal or political equal of white men and white Anglo-Saxon Americans. Also, in addition to these intolerant and insensitive racial views that Wilson had when he was a college student, when he became president, he appointed several Southern Democrats to various cabinet positions. The vast majority of the Southern Democrats that he appointed to his cabinet were blatant, outright racists, and they had no incentive to hide it at the time, because it was accepted that they could act that way. In addition to Wilson's personal beliefs, his presidency and his promotion of Southern Democrats to high-profile cabinet positions, as well as the release of the early American film, The Birth of a Nation, which was based on a a book by Thomas Dixon that had been published in the early 1900s. This was a 1915 film, The Birth of a Nation. It is very sympathetic to the Confederacy, very much espousing views that Wilson and many white Southerners would agree with. It sort of fits neatly into the lost cause narrative that we've talked about before in this class, and the release of that film and its popularity, as well as Wilson's status as president and an openly white supremacist president, these two things taken together inspired the second incarnation of the Ku Klux Klan to take place. We talked about the KKK earlier this semester, and it was founded in the wake of the Civil War and was active during the Reconstruction era, but it had been dormant for decades until about 1915, 1916, when it once again formed in the Atlanta, Georgia area and spread very quickly throughout the South and even outside of the South. We'll talk about that a little more in the next week or two, but that's an important development that was aided in part by Woodrow Wilson's stance as a white supremacist with regard to the race issue and African Americans before he was president and while he was president of the United States. And if you take a look in the upper right-hand corner, that is a photograph of Woodrow Wilson as president. So that was progressivism under Wilson. You can see he was very progressive with regard to banking and financial issues, as well as regulations of corporations. But in social issues, he was not progressive at all, and was an opponent of social programs and the federal government having a role in operating social programs. So that will wrap up our lecture for today, and we will shift gears significantly on Friday with our final lecture of the week as we discuss American foreign policy and American diplomacy in the late 1890s up through the 1920s, as we look at Roosevelt's foreign policy agenda, and we'll go from there. So that's what we will discuss on Friday. Until then, have a great rest of your midweek, and we'll talk to you again on Friday.